His wife filed for divorce the same day she told him she'd finally become everything she was meant to be. She stood in front of 30 people, family, neighbors, people who had eaten at their table, and she handed him an envelope, raised a glass with her mother, and told him he had served his purpose. She had her law degree. She had her bar card. She had a new man, a new firm, a new life, and none of it, she believed, had anything to do with him anymore. What she did not know, what she could not have known because he had never told her, because a quiet man rarely announces what he carries, was that the law firm she had just accepted an offer from, the firm whose name she had bragged about at that cookout like it was a trophy she had finally earned, was majority owned by the man she had just thrown away, not partially, not on paper, in some distant technical sense. 51%, controlling interest, every case she would ever bill, every paycheck she would ever earn, every promotion she would ever chase, all of it ran through a trust that bore his family's name and his signature. She didn't outgrow him, she walked directly back into his hands. If you are new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the quiet ones finally get their moment. If this story hits different, drop a like before we even get started and tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. I want to see who's here for this one. Now let me take you all the way back to where this started, a 4th of July cookout in Charlotte, North Carolina, a backyard full of people, a plate of ribs, and a manila envelope that a good man accepted without saying a single word. The smoke from the grill had been rising since noon. Darius Webb stood at that grill the way he did everything, quietly, without announcement, tending to what needed tending. He had seasoned the ribs the night before using his Aunt Clara's dry rub, the one written on a folded index card he kept in the kitchen drawer next to the dish towels. He had been up at 7 that morning, cutting watermelon, arranging the folding tables, dragging the cooler from the garage. By the time the first guests arrived, everything was already in order. That was Darius, everything in order, always. His neighbors from Beatty's Ford Road came through the side gate first, older men who dapped him up and accepted paper plates without ceremony. Miss Odette from next door brought her potato salad in the same bowl she brought it in every year, covered in plastic wrap, still warm. The kids from the block ran through the yard, chasing each other around the oak tree in the corner. Somebody had a Bluetooth speaker going with old school, playing low. It felt like what it was supposed to feel like. Then the Hargroves arrived. Evelyn Hargrove did not enter a space so much as she took possession of it. She came through the gate in a white linen pantsuit, with her church friends flanking her like a processional, talking loud before she was fully inside, her voice carrying across the yard like she had already claimed it. She kissed cheeks and squeezed hands and positioned herself at the center of the gathering with the practiced ease of a woman who had been rehearsing significance her entire life. Keisha came in behind her mother, and she was glowing. She wore a yellow sundress and a smile that Darius had not seen directed at him in longer than he cared to count. She moved through the crowd with a new kind of electricity, greeting people with both hands, laughing easily, her law school graduation ring catching the afternoon light. Darius watched her from the grill and felt something he couldn't name settle in his chest like a stone. It was Evelyn who called for quiet. She tapped a plastic cup with a plastic fork and waited for the yard to settle, and when it did, she looked around at the assembled family and neighbors with the expression of a woman about to deliver a verdict she had been holding for years. "I just want to take a moment," Evelyn said, "to celebrate my daughter. Keisha Hargrove Webb passed the bar exam on her first attempt." She paused to let the applause land, then raised her chin slightly. "She has accepted an associate position at Webb & Callison Legal Group, the oldest black-owned law firm in Charlotte." Another pause, longer this time. "And she is finally stepping into the life she was always meant to have." The yard clapped. Some people cheered. Miss Odette smiled politely and looked at the ground. It was Keisha who spoke next. She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope and walked it across the yard to Darius the way you walk something to someone when you want witnesses. She held it out, and he took it because there was nothing else to do. The envelope was thick, pre-stuffed, already processed. This had been in motion for a long time. "The papers are filed," Keisha said, and her voice was calm in a way that was worse than anger. "I need to show up as the woman I've become, Darius, and that woman needs room that this life doesn't have." She didn't say Brandon's name. She didn't need to. Half the yard already knew. The other half would know by sundown. Evelyn raised her cup. Nobody on Darius's side of the yard moved. Miss Odette set down her fork. One of the older men near the cooler looked at the ground. The children had stopped running. Darius looked at the envelope in his hand. Then he tucked it under his arm. Then he picked up his plate of ribs from the table beside the grill, pulled out a chair, sat down, and ate. He finished every bite. He stood, threw away his plate, wiped his hands on a paper towel, and walked to his truck without looking at anyone. No words, no visible expression, just the crunch of gravel under his boots and the sound of the gate closing behind him. He almost made it. Terence caught him at the driver's side door. Keisha's cousin, 20 years in a warehouse, one of the only Hargroves who had ever looked Darius in the eye like he was somebody. Terence grabbed his arm, not hard, and leaned in close. "I don't know if it matters," Terence said quietly. "But your Uncle Herbert, rest his soul, had a real good lawyer, the one Keisha just went to work for." Darius went very still. He didn't ask a follow-up question. He didn't change his expression. He nodded once, got in the truck, and pulled out of the driveway at the same speed he always drove. 2 miles away he pulled into the parking lot of Greater Harvest Baptist and put the truck in park. The engine ticked in the heat. The manila envelope sat on the passenger seat. Gospel leaked faintly from the church's side door, left open in the July warmth. Darius Webb sat in that parking lot for a long time. He did not cry, he did not make a phone call, he just sat there, very still, the way a man sits when something is rearranging itself inside him, when grief and recognition arrive at the same moment, and he doesn't yet have a word for what he's holding. But to understand why that moment landed the way it did, you have to go back. Back to the beginning of what Darius Webb agreed to carry, and how long he carried it before anyone knew his name was on the deed. To understand Darius Webb, you have to understand what he came from. He was not a man who talked about himself. He did not post about his achievements or lead with his resume or require a room to know his name before he entered it. He had grown up watching his Uncle Herbert move through the world that way, quietly, purposefully, with a kind of dignity that didn't need an audience, and somewhere along the way that became the only model Darius trusted. He had done 2 tours, come home in one piece, and built a steady life in logistics contracting that paid well and asked nothing of him except competence, which he had in abundance. He owned his truck outright. He had savings. He went to church on Sundays at Greater Harvest and shook hands with the same men he had known since boyhood and did not feel the need to explain himself to anyone. Then he met Keisha Hargrove. She was brilliant and restless and burning with ambition, and in the beginning that fire felt like warmth. They married in the spring of 2017 in a ceremony at Keisha's family church, and Darius stood at that altar in his best suit, feeling like a man who had finally found the one thing his discipline alone could not build for him. He did not see the architecture of what he was walking into. The Hargroves were a family that measured everything. They measured houses by square footage and cars by model year, and men by the size of the doors their last name could open. Evelyn Hargrove had worked 30 years as a school administrator and spent every one of those years cultivating an image of her family's standing, with the care and precision of a woman who understood that perception, in her world, was everything. Darius did not fit the image. He was good, he was solid, he was kind in the specific, unglamorous way of a man who actually shows up. But he did not have a title, and he did not have a family name that meant anything on the east side of Charlotte, and in Evelyn's accounting that made him temporary. She said as much at a Sunday dinner in the fall of 2018, 18 months into the marriage, when she thought Darius was still in the kitchen. He wasn't. He was in the hallway, and he heard her tell Keisha's aunt that Keisha had always been the type to use one relationship to get to the next. She called him Keisha's first husband with the breezy certainty of a woman announcing the weather. Darius walked back into the kitchen, fixed his plate, and sat down at the table. He never mentioned it. In those early years, Keisha still pushed back against her mother in small ways. She would squeeze Darius's hand when Evelyn made a pointed comment. She would say, "We decided," instead of "I decided." But the language shifted gradually the way water reshapes stone, slowly enough that you don't notice until the shape is already different. By 2019, Keisha had decided she wanted to go to law school. Darius said yes before she finished the sentence. He paid for the LSAT prep course, $600, without discussion. He covered the application fees for 8 schools. When she got into Charlotte School of Law, he paid the first semester's tuition himself, $12,000, while maintaining the mortgage and the utilities and the groceries and every other cost of a household that was now running on one income. He did not keep a ledger. That was not who he was. What sustained him through those years, more than anything, was Herbert. Herbert Webb was 64 when Darius came home from his second tour, and he was already one of Charlotte's most quietly respected men. A founding partner of a law firm, a deacon at his church, a man whose handshake meant something in rooms Darius was still learning existed. He had never had children of his own, and he poured everything he would have given a son into his nephew. They talked every week, sometimes at Herbert's house on Sycamore Street over coffee, and whatever Herbert had cooking, sometimes just by phone. Herbert asked about the work, about the marriage, about whether Darius was taking care of himself. He never asked about Evelyn, but sometimes at the end of a conversation he would say something like, "A man who knows his own worth doesn't need anybody else to announce it for him." And Darius would nod and carry it home. Herbert's health began to slip in 2021. His heart, the doctors said. Then his kidneys. Darius drove to Sycamore Street every weekend he could manage, sitting with his uncle through the slow surrender of a strong man's body. Herbert never complained. He talked about the firm he had built, about the young lawyers he had mentored, about what he hoped his legacy would mean. Herbert died on a Tuesday morning in October of that year, and Darius got the call in a parking lot outside a warehouse in Gastonia. He sat in his truck for 45 minutes before he drove anywhere. Keisha attended the funeral. She sat beside Darius in the front pew of Greater Harvest and held his hand during the service, and he was grateful for that. But when the repast began, the tables of food in the fellowship hall, the deacons telling Herbert stories, the old women pressing Darius's face between their hands. Keisha checked her phone twice, kissed his cheek, and said she had a study group she couldn't miss. She was gone before the sweet potato pie was served. 3 days later, Darius sat in the office of Gerald Aldridge, Herbert's attorney, on the 14th floor of a building uptown. Gerald was patient and thorough. He walked Darius through documents, through the trust structure, through the nature of what Herbert had left behind. Darius signed where Gerald told him to sign. He nodded when Gerald explained things. But the grief was sitting directly on top of his comprehension, like a weight pressing everything flat. He drove home to an empty house, Keisha still at the library, and stood in the kitchen for a long time holding Herbert's pocket watch. gold-cased, worn smooth on the back, the initials HW scratched faint from decades of handling. He set it on the kitchen counter and went to bed. The years after that were a hollowing out. Keisha finished her first year of law school, then her second. She was home less and less, and when she was home, she was studying. And when she wasn't studying, she was somewhere Darius wasn't invited. A name started appearing in her conversation. Brandon, from her study group, a senior associate at a firm downtown, someone who understood what she was building in a way, the implication was clear, that Darius did not. Darius noticed the name. He noticed the dinners that ran late and the texts that got angled away from him and the silences that landed in rooms where there used to be conversation. He did not confront any of it. He went to work, he kept the house, he went to church. Keisha graduated in the spring of 2024, and Darius sat in the auditorium in a pressed shirt and watched her cross the stage. Evelyn sat on his left and spent the entire ceremony leaning across him to speak to her sister, as if he were a column rather than a person. In every photograph taken outside afterward, Evelyn positioned herself at Keisha's side with the practiced ease of a woman who had been rehearsing that picture for years. Darius appeared in 2 of the photos at the edge, slightly out of frame. The bar results came 6 weeks later. Keisha passed on her first attempt, and Evelyn threw a celebration party at her own house on Remington Drive, not at the home Darius and Keisha shared, but at Evelyn's house, where the framing of the story could be controlled completely. Darius was invited, as an afterthought 3 days before, by text. He went because he was still her husband, and because that is what Darius Webb did. He stood near the kitchen with a plastic cup of sparkling grape juice and listened to Evelyn tell a room full of Keisha's family and sorority sisters that her daughter had done this all by herself, that she had worked and sacrificed and pushed through every obstacle life put in her path. Darius was standing 8 feet away. Keisha looked at him once, briefly, and then looked away. The offer letter from Webb and Callison arrived the following week. Keisha called her mother before she came home. Darius heard about it from Evelyn, who called the house phone the next morning and spoke to Keisha while Darius sat at the kitchen table eating toast. Evelyn's voice carried through the receiver. Webb and Callison, the oldest black-owned firm in Charlotte, exactly where Keisha belongs. That night, after Keisha had gone to sleep, Darius sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and typed the name into the search bar. Webb and Callison Legal Group, Charlotte. The results loaded. He looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he closed the laptop without reading past the first line. He sat in the dark kitchen for a while, Herbert's pocket watch on the counter beside his coffee cup, the house quiet around him. 1 week later came the cookout, and 3 days after that Darius Webb drove uptown with a folder he had kept in a filing cabinet for 26 months and walked into Gerald Aldridge's office to find out exactly what his uncle had left him. Gerald Aldridge's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Tryon Street, and it looked exactly like the office of a man who had spent 40 years doing serious work seriously. The shelves held law books with cracked spines. The desk was solid mahogany, worn at the corners. A small, framed photograph sat near the window. Herbert Webb and Gerald Aldridge, younger, standing outside a building Darius did not recognize, both of them laughing at something the camera had not caught. Darius looked at that photograph for a moment before he sat down. Gerald himself was exactly as Darius remembered from the estate meeting 26 months ago. 68 years old, silver at the temples, the kind of stillness that comes from decades of delivering news, good and devastating, to people sitting across a desk. He rose when Darius entered, shook his hand with both of his, and held it a beat longer than was strictly necessary. "I wondered when you'd come back," Gerald said. "Herbert wondered too. He told me you would. Eventually." Darius set the manila folder on the desk, the Herbert Webb estate folder, the one he had kept in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in the spare room behind the tax returns, untouched since the week after the funeral. He had pulled it out the morning after the cookout and read every page twice before sleeping. He sat down. Gerald sat down. And this time, Darius was ready to listen. Gerald began with the structure, the Herbert Webb Revocable Trust, established in 2003 and amended most recently in 2019. The amendment, Gerald explained, was the critical document, the one Herbert had insisted on after Darius's second deployment, when Herbert had updated the succession clause to name his nephew as sole primary beneficiary, specifically conditioned on Darius's military service record as proof of the character Herbert required. The trust held one primary asset, a 51% controlling stake in Webb and Callison Legal Group. Darius was quiet for a moment. "Walk me through that." Gerald walked him through it. Webb and Callison had been co-founded in 1979 by Herbert Webb and a man named Raymond Callison, who had since passed. The firm's founding partnership agreement named Herbert's trust as the majority stakeholder, meaning whoever controlled the trust controlled the firm. The remaining 49% was distributed among 3 managing partners who had bought in over the decades. The firm grossed $14 million annually. Darius's inherited stake carried a current assessed value of $6.2 million. The annual trustee distributions, his share of the firm's earnings, which had accumulated untouched since Herbert's death, totaled $380,000 in arrears, sitting in a trust account Gerald had been maintaining, waiting. Darius absorbed this the way he absorbed most things, without visible reaction, without rushing to speak. Gerald continued. As controlling trustee, Darius held specific authorities written directly into the firm's bylaws, authorities that existed precisely because the founding documents anticipated majority ownership passing through the trust. Those authorities included the right to call a financial audit of the firm's accounts at any time, the right to attend and vote at any partnership meeting, and the right to ratify or deny any personnel action, including new hires, that fell above a certain salary threshold. "Every associate hire requires trustee ratification," Gerald said carefully. "It's a formality in practice. The managing partners submit the paperwork. The trustee signs off. It's never been contested." "But if the trustee hasn't been activated," Darius said slowly, "those ratifications haven't happened." Gerald looked at him steadily. "Correct. For the past 26 months, the trust has been in a dormant state. No trustee has been exercising authority. The managing partners have been operating under a good faith assumption of continuity." He paused. "Any personnel actions taken during that period would be subject to retroactive review upon trustee activation." Darius was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Is Keisha Webb currently listed as an employee of Webb and Callison?" Gerald did not flinch. He turned to his computer, typed for a moment, read what appeared on the screen. Then he looked back at Darius. "She is. Hired as a first-year associate. Start date 2 weeks from now. Her offer letter was executed by one of the managing partners." He paused. "Her hire was never submitted for trustee ratification. Under the dormant trust, there was no trustee to submit it to." The room was very quiet. Darius looked out the window at the Charlotte skyline. He thought about the cookout, the envelope, the plate of ribs he had finished in silence while 30 people watched. He thought about the repast after Herbert's funeral and the empty chair where Keisha had been sitting before she left for her study group. He thought about Herbert's voice on the phone all those years. A man who knows his own worth doesn't need anybody else to announce it for him. He turned back to Gerald. "What are my options?" Gerald reached into a desk drawer and produced a single sheet of paper. Clean, formal, 2 signature lines at the bottom. The Herbert Webb Revocable Trust Trustee Activation Form. Gerald had clearly prepared it before Darius arrived. He set it on the desk between them and folded his hands. "Once you sign this, the trust is active. I file the notification with the firm within 24 hours. Their own bylaws require them to respond. From that point forward, everything proceeds by the rules Herbert wrote into those founding documents 45 years ago." Gerald's voice was even and precise. "You don't have to do anything dramatic, Darius. You just have to be what you already are." Darius reached across the desk. He picked up the pen. And everything that was about to happen to Keisha Webb, to Brandon Alcott, to the firm whose name she had bragged about at a cookout like it was something she had earned, all of it began in that moment with a quiet man signing a piece of paper in an office on the 14th floor. The city spread out below him, his uncle's photograph watching from the windowsill. He signed his name. The clock started. The plan was simple. That was the most important thing about it. Gerald had seen men in Darius's position do foolish things. He had seen them make phone calls they shouldn't have made and send messages that ended up as exhibits and show up places they had no business being, driven by the need to watch the fire they had started with their own eyes before it had fully caught. He told Darius all of this the morning after the signing, sitting across from him in the same mahogany office with 2 cups of coffee between them, speaking plainly. "The law is already written in your favor," Gerald said. "Herbert made sure of that in 1979 and made it stronger in 2019. All we do is follow the procedure. The procedure does everything else." Darius nodded once. That was enough. The strategy had 3 steps and required Darius to take exactly 0 visible action after the signing. Step 1. Gerald would file the trustee activation notice with Webb and Callison's managing partners, as required by the firm's own bylaws. The notice was standard, formal. It would arrive on letterhead bearing the trust's name, not Darius's. To the partners, it would read like a routine administrative update, the kind of thing that happens when an estate finally settles and someone steps into a long dormant role. Step 2 followed automatically from Step 1. The firm's founding bylaws, drafted by Herbert himself in consultation with Raymond Callison 45 years ago, included a mandatory provision. Upon activation of the controlling trust, a full financial and personnel audit would be initiated within 30 days. It was a protection Herbert had insisted on, a way to ensure that whoever inherited his stake would know exactly what they were inheriting. Gerald had always admired that clause. He admired it considerably more now. Step 3 required no action from anyone. The audit findings would dictate consequences. Darius would not direct the outcome. He would not call the firm. He would not contact Keisha or Brandon. Whatever the audit found, it would find on its own, reported by an independent firm with no connection to Darius Webb. Gerald retained Harman and Associates, forensic accountants out of Raleigh, experienced with law firm audits. That same afternoon, the engagement letter went out under the trust's name. The retainer was paid from the $380,000 in arrears that had been sitting in Gerald's trust account for 26 months, untouched, waiting. Darius did not need to spend $1 of his own money. Before he left Gerald's office that second morning, Darius pulled out his phone and made one call. Terence picked up on the second ring. "I just wanted to say thank you," Darius said, "for what you told me at the car." Terence was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You good?" "Getting there." "All right then." A pause. "I don't know nothing about nothing, by the way." "I know you don't," Darius said. "I appreciate that." He hung up. That was the entirety of the conversation. Terence asked no questions and would answer none. That was the kind of man he was, and Darius had always known it. Gerald called 3 days later with one additional piece of information. Keisha's attorney had formally initiated the asset disclosure process as part of the divorce proceedings, standard procedure required by North Carolina law. Her attorney had submitted the request expecting to find a logistics contractor's savings account, a truck, and half the equity in a jointly owned house. Gerald noted this with the calm of a man who already knew the answer to a question nobody had asked yet. When the disclosure came back bearing the full details of the Herbert Webb Revocable Trust, the $6.2 million valuation, the controlling stake, the $380,000 in distributions, Keisha's attorney was going to call her immediately. And by that point, Darius reflected, she would already have several other things to worry about. He moved into Herbert's house on a Wednesday. The house on Sycamore Street had been sitting empty for 2 years, the utilities maintained at minimum by Gerald's office as part of the estate administration. It was a solid craftsman house, 3 bedrooms, the kind of house that had been built to last and had proven it. The yard needed attention. The kitchen smelled faintly of the cedar sachets Herbert had kept in every closet. The gospel radio on the counter still had a station programmed in, WGIV 103.9, and when Darius turned it on the first evening, something instrumental and old came through the speaker, and he stood in Herbert's kitchen listening to it for a long time before he started unpacking. He went through the house room by room over the following evenings unhurried. He washed the dishes that had sat clean in the cabinet for 2 years. He sat in Herbert's chair in the living room and felt the worn arms of it beneath his hands. He went through the study last. It was in the study, in a cardboard box on the bottom shelf of the bookcase, that he found the photograph. It was 8 by 10, framed in plain black wood, slightly dusty, Herbert Webb and a 22-year-old Darius standing in dress uniform outside the armory in Fayetteville on the day of Darius's commissioning ceremony, June of 1999. Herbert was in his best suit, the grey one with the fine chalk stripe, grinning with his whole face in the way he only grinned when he was genuinely proud. Young Darius stood straight-backed beside him, holding his cover under his arm, trying not to smile too wide. He had not seen this photograph in 20 years. He had not known Herbert kept it. Darius stood in the study for a long moment holding it. Then he carried it to the living room and set it on the mantel. He stepped back, looked at it, nodded once to no one in particular. Across town, the certified letter from Gerald Aldridge's office was already in the mail. The certified letter arrived at Webb & Callison on a Thursday morning. Marcus Callison, senior managing partner, and the firm's last surviving founding-era name on the masthead, signed for it himself at the front desk. He read the return address on the envelope, Aldridge Estate Law, Uptown Charlotte, and felt a cold, unfamiliar stillness move through him before he had even broken the seal. He read it twice, standing at the reception desk. Then he walked directly to his office and closed the door. The letter was formal and precise. It notified Webb & Callison Legal Group that the Herbert Webb Revocable Trust had entered active administration under its newly engaged trustee, effective immediately. It cited the specific bylaw provision, Section 7, Paragraph 100 of the original 1979 partnership agreement, that triggered a mandatory full financial and personnel audit upon trustee activation. It named Harman & Associates of Raleigh as the retained forensic accounting firm. It gave the firm 5 business days to prepare records access. Marcus Callison picked up his phone and called the other 2 managing partners into his office within the hour. They pulled the founding documents. They read Section 7, Paragraph 100 together. Nobody spoke for a long moment after. Then one of them said, "Who is the trustee?" Marcus looked at the letter again. The trust's name was on the letterhead. The trustee's name was not. They voted unanimously to comply. There was no other legal option. The Harman & Associates team arrived the following Monday. 4 accountants with laptops and access credentials installed in the firm's small conference room, working through billing records, client trust accounts, and personnel files with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before and knew exactly what they were looking for. They found it on day 4. Brandon Alcott's billing records contained $43,000 in irregularities spread across 18 months. restaurant charges, hotel stays in Asheville and Charleston, first-class airfare upgrades, a luxury car rental billed to a client account for a case that had been settled by phone, all of it coded under client matter numbers, buried in line items, consistent enough in pattern to be deliberate, and careless enough in execution to be arrogant. The managing partners were notified by the Harmon team on a Wednesday afternoon. By 4 o'clock that same day, Brandon Alcott had been escorted from the building. His access credentials were revoked before he reached his car. The referral to the North Carolina State Bar was drafted and transmitted before close of business. He called Keisha from the parking lot. She was at her apartment when her phone rang, still unpacking boxes, still arranging the life she had been so certain was finally beginning. She answered on the second ring and stood in the middle of her living room while Brandon talked. Whatever he said, the color left her face in stages, like water draining from a tub. She sat down on the edge of a box she hadn't opened yet, and did not say much. When she hung up, she sat very still for a long time. The next morning, HR called. Keisha's associate position at Webb & Callison, the offer letter she had carried into that cookout like a credential, the desk she had not yet sat behind for a single billable hour. It had never been formally ratified under the trust's oversight clause. The HR director explained this in measured professional language. The hire was under review pending trustee ratification. Pending that ratification, her employment could not be confirmed. She was asked to come in and collect her personal items. She walked out of Webb & Callison Legal Group on a Tuesday morning, 28 days after passing the bar, a cardboard box in her arms, sunglasses on, head straight. Darius's truck was parked on the opposite side of the street. He had arrived early and parked under the shade of a water oak, the engine off, a cup of coffee from the gas station on Commonwealth going cold in the cup holder. He watched her come through the front doors, watched her cross the sidewalk to her car, watched her load the box into the back seat without looking around. He did not get out. He did not approach. He simply watched, with the calm of a man who had already processed his grief long before this moment arrived. Then he drove away. Keisha called her mother from the parking deck. Evelyn's first response, before she had been told a single fact about what was actually happening, was to say that Darius was behind this. She said it with such immediate certainty that it almost sounded like intuition. She said it loudly, and then she said it again, and then she started telling Keisha what she needed to do, who she needed to call, how this could be fixed, how this was an attack, how nobody was going to do this to her daughter. Keisha listened. She drove to Remington Drive. She sat in her car outside her mother's house. She did not go in. Her phone buzzed 40 minutes later. Her divorce attorney. His voice was careful in the way that attorneys get careful when they have something to say that they have never had to say before. The asset disclosure had come back from Gerald Aldridge's office, the Herbert Webb Revocable Trust, controlling stake in Webb and Callison Legal Group, assessed value $6.2 million, arrears distributions $380,000 uncollected, all of it inherited by the trustee, all of it belonging to Darius Webb. Her attorney asked if she had known about this. She did not answer right away. The pieces assembled themselves in the silence. The firm's name, Herbert Webb, the cookout, Terence at the car, Darius's expression when she had first mentioned the firm's name, that strange stillness she had read as resignation, and had not looked at closely enough. She had not outgrown him. She had not escaped. She had walked, with her bar card and her offer letter and her mother's toast ringing in her ears, directly into the majority owner's house, and sat down at his table like she had earned a seat there. She sat in her car outside Evelyn's house for a long time, her phone screen lit up. 17 missed calls from Evelyn, 1 text from Brandon which she did not open, and on the screen of her attorney's email, visible through the car window reflection, Darius Webb's name appeared in the asset disclosure column she had never imagined he would occupy. Not as a defendant, as a creditor. She sent one message to Gerald Aldridge's office that evening. She requested a meeting. She asked that Darius be present. Gerald replied within the hour. He confirmed the meeting for Thursday at 10. He named the location, Webb and Callison Legal Group, main conference room. Darius arrived at 9:45. He wore a dark suit he had pressed himself that morning in Herbert's house, the iron moving slow and deliberate over the fabric, the way Herbert had taught him to do it when he was 17 years old. He wore a plain white shirt and a tie his uncle had given him years ago. Burgundy, silk, understated. He did not check himself in a mirror before he left. He already knew how he looked. Gerald was already in the conference room when Darius arrived, seated at the side wall in one of the chairs reserved for observers, a leather folder on his knee. The room was wood-panelled and quiet. A long mahogany table ran down the centre, 12 chairs around it. Morning light came through the windows and lay flat across the table like a cloth. Darius sat at the head of the table. He did not open anything. He did not look at his phone. He folded his hands on the table and waited, the way a man waits when he has already decided everything, and there is nothing left to decide. Keisha arrived at 10:10 with Evelyn at her side. Evelyn had not been invited. Gerald had confirmed the meeting for 2 parties. He did not comment on her presence. He did not ask her to leave. He simply noted it with the mild expression of a man who had anticipated exactly this and adjusted accordingly. Keisha sat across from Darius. She had dressed carefully, professional, composed, every element of her appearance arranged to project control. But her eyes moved too quickly around the room, and her hands, when she set her portfolio on the table, were not entirely steady. Evelyn sat one seat down, upright, jaw set, already radiating the particular energy of a woman prepared to intervene. Keisha opened. She spoke in the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed. She said that Brandon's situation was a separate matter with no bearing on her own employment status. She said that her hire had followed standard firm procedure. She said that the retroactive application of a dormant trust clause to an already executed offer was legally contestable. She used the word contestable twice. She said that she had not come to be ambushed, she had come to discuss a path forward that was fair to everyone involved. She stopped talking. Darius looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if she had said something he had expected to hear. And then he began. He started with the cookout, not with anger, not with accusation. He described it the way a man describes a thing he has turned over in his hands so many times that all the rough edges have gone smooth. He described the morning he spent seasoning the ribs, Miss Odette's potato salad, the children chasing each other around the oak tree. He described the moment Evelyn tapped her cup and called for quiet, and the way the yard went still. He described Keisha walking the envelope across the yard to him in front of 30 people. The weight of it. The deliberateness of the walk. He described tucking the envelope under his arm, picking up his plate, sitting down, and finishing every bite. "I did that," he said quietly, "because I was not going to give you or your mother the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in public, not that day, not ever." He described the drive to the church parking lot, the envelope on the passenger seat, Terence's hand on his arm at the truck door, the words Terence said. And then he described driving to Gerald Aldridge's office with the estate folder he had kept in a filing cabinet for 26 months, the folder he had signed and then put away because he was grieving and did not understand what he was signing, and came home to an empty house and stood in the kitchen holding a dead man's pocket watch. "I paid for 7 years of your life," Darius said. His voice was even, unhurried. It cut through the room like a blade through still water. The LSAT prep, the application fees, the first year of tuition, the mortgage while you were in school, the utilities, the groceries, every single month for 7 years, documented, $74,000, and I never once mentioned it, not once. Because I didn't do it to hold it over you. I did it because you were my wife." He paused. "The night Herbert died, you came to the repast. You sat beside me for the service. And then you left before the food was served because you had a study group." The room was very quiet. "A study group," he said again. Not louder, just placed there, in the silence, where it could be heard fully. Evelyn shifted in her seat. She opened her mouth. Darius turned and looked at her directly. Not with rage, with something colder and more complete than rage. "Evelyn," he said her name once. "You called me Keisha's first husband at your dinner table while I was in your kitchen. You told a room full of people that your daughter did this all by herself while I was standing 8 feet away. You raised a glass at a cookout to celebrate the end of my marriage." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. "I don't have anything else to say to you." He turned back to Keisha. "You passed the bar and decided you were finally too good for me. You stood in front of your whole family and told them you were done with the man who wasn't going anywhere. But the first place you walked into as a lawyer, the firm whose name was on your offer letter, the desk you were so proud to sit behind, the man you left me for, all of it was sitting inside something my uncle built and left to me." He let that land. He let it sit in the room and settle into every corner before he continued. "You didn't outgrow me, Keisha. You walked straight back into my hands and didn't even know it." Keisha did not speak. Her composure did not shatter all at once. It left her the way air leaves a room when a door finally opens. Slowly at first, then completely. Her eyes went bright and wet. Her jaw tightened. She looked at the table. Evelyn made a sound. It might have been the beginning of a word. It went nowhere. After a long silence, Keisha looked up. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Darius looked at her steadily. "Nothing from you. The trust is mine. The firm is mine. The marriage is over." He glanced toward Gerald at the side wall. "Gerald will handle the asset proceedings. His office will be in touch with your attorney." He pushed his chair back. He stood. He smoothed the front of his jacket and buttoned the single button with the calm of a man who has nowhere he needs to be and nothing left to prove. He walked to the door. Behind him, Evelyn found her voice. She called his name. Then she called it again, louder, with all the authority she had spent 30 years assembling. Darius walked through the door and into the hallway and did not break his stride for a single step. He did not turn around. 6 months later, the world looked nothing like Keisha Hargrove had planned it to look. Brandon Alcott's bar license was under active suspension pending the outcome of the North Carolina State Bar's disciplinary investigation. The criminal referral filed by Webb and Callison for trust account misappropriation had been accepted by the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office. $43,000 in stolen client funds, 18 months of deliberate concealment, and a termination letter that had been waiting in the managing partner's files since the day the Harmon team printed out their findings. Brandon was not practicing law. He was not likely to practice law again. Whatever future Keisha had imagined standing beside him had been built on a foundation of fraud she hadn't known to look for. The divorce settlement was final by October. Keisha's attorney had come into the process expecting a standard marital asset split. What he found instead was a trust structured as inheritance, predating the marriage by decades, ironclad under North Carolina law, entirely beyond the reach of the settlement table. The Herbert Webb Revocable Trust belonged to Darius alone. It had always belonged to Darius alone. The marital estate that remained after that determination consisted of 1 jointly owned house with modest equity and 2 checking accounts. Her attorney's fees, substantial by the end, consumed most of her share. She walked away with less than she had walked in with. Evelyn Hargrove, who had spent the better part of a year telling everyone who would listen about her daughter's position at the oldest black-owned law firm in Charlotte, at the dinner table, at church, at the hair salon on Freedom Drive, at every social function she could engineer an audience at, went quiet. Not gradually, all at once. The way a person goes quiet when the story they have been telling falls apart publicly and completely, and there is no version of it left to salvage. Nobody on Remington Drive mentioned Webb and Callison anymore. Nobody asked. Evelyn still went to church. She still sat in the third pew on the left. But she had stopped arriving early, and she had stopped holding court in the fellowship hall after service, and the particular confidence with which she had once occupied every room she entered had diminished in a way that everyone noticed, and nobody said out loud. Darius did not attend that church anymore. He had transferred his membership to Greater Harvest, which had been his church before the marriage, and which had always felt, if he was honest, more like home. He sat in the same section every Sunday, shook the same hands, stayed for the repast when there was one, and went home to Herbert's house on Sycamore Street, where the gospel radio still played in the kitchen and the cedar sachets still kept the closet smelling the way they had always smelled. He drove the same truck. In November, 6 months after the cookout and 4 months after the conference room, Darius formally announced the establishment of the Herbert Webb Fellowship through the Webb and Callison Legal Group's Community Foundation. $50,000 annually awarded to a first-generation law student at Johnson C. Smith University. The first recipient was a 23-year-old from Gastonia named Marcus Ellison, the son of a sanitation worker who had written in his application essay about wanting to be the kind of lawyer who remembered where he came from. The announcement event was held at the firm. Darius stood at a podium in front of the managing partners and a room full of JCSU faculty and students and said a few words about his uncle, about the kind of man Herbert was, about the way he moved through the world, about what it meant to build something that outlasted you. He was not a practiced public speaker. He did not need to be. He spoke plainly and briefly, and the room was completely quiet for every word of it. Afterward, during the reception, a woman introduced herself. Her name was Simone Parrish. She taught 8th grade history at a Charlotte-Mecklenburg middle school, and she had come because one of her former students had applied for the fellowship, and she had written him a recommendation letter and wanted to see how it turned out. She was warm in the way that people are warm when they have nothing to prove. She asked Darius a real question about his uncle. Not a polite question, a real one, and listened to the answer without looking around the room. They talked for 20 minutes near the window while the reception moved around them. When the event ended and people began gathering their coats, Darius asked if she wanted to get coffee sometime. Simone said yes without hesitation. That was all. No drama, no performance. Just a yes, and a phone number written on the back of a program, and 2 people who had both done the hard work of becoming themselves standing in a room full of good light. There is something this story has been building toward, and it is not the confrontation in the conference room, though that moment mattered. It is not the audit findings or the settlement or the fellowship announcement, though all of those mattered too. What this story has been building toward is something quieter than any of that. It is the truth that a man can carry everything. Grief, sacrifice, public humiliation, years of being dismissed and underestimated and treated like furniture, and never once lose himself in the carrying. That patience is not weakness, that silence is not defeat, that the world does not always recognize the worth of a quiet man in the moment, but the moment always comes. Herbert Webb knew that. He built something and put his nephew's name on it and waited for the day Darius would be ready to understand what it meant. That day came at a 4th of July cookout, when a woman handed her husband an envelope in front of 30 people and told him she was done. She had no idea who she was handing it to. That evening, back on Sycamore Street, Darius stood in the living room of his uncle's house in the blue light of early evening, the gospel radio going soft in the kitchen, the smell of cedar in the air. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out Herbert's pocket watch. Gold-cased, worn smooth on the back, the initials HW scratched faint from decades of use. He held it for a moment. Then he set it on the mantel beside the commissioning photo. Herbert Webb, in his chalk-striped suit, grinning with his whole face. Young Darius standing straight-backed beside him, trying not to smile too wide. Darius looked at it for a long moment. Then he got his jacket, locked the front door, and left for church. Now, before you go, I want to ask you something. If you had been in Darius's position, sitting in that truck in the church parking lot with that envelope on the seat beside you, knowing what Terence had just said, what would you have done? Would you have waited the way Darius did? Or would you have moved differently? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for getting stories like this one in front of people who need to hear them. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next, because there is always another story, and the next one is coming soon.